I'm Melanie Hobbs, Senior Associate Director of Educational Issues. On behalf of the American Federation of Teachers, thank you for joining the Identity-Affirming Classroom Team Thought Partner Series. Thank you to all the allies, warriors, and change makers who day in and day out carry out the mission of empowering schools, families, and the broader community to create and sustain learning environments where students feel a sense of safety and connectedness, can show up as their authentic selves, develop purpose and agency, and celebrate the diversity in the world around us. During our first episode, we had an intimate conversation with leading authors and longtime friends of the AFT, Dr. Becky Cohn-Vargas and Dr. Debbi Zecharian, about chapters 1 and 2 of their new book, Identity Safe Spaces at Home and School, Partnering to Overcome Inequity. We discussed the importance of understanding identity safety and gained strategies for creating a culture of caring. Our guest contributor, Vincent Pompey, whose lived experiences were chronicled in these chapters, brought life and dimension to the power of home-school partnerships and the important role we all play in fostering identity safety. And for those of you joining us for the first time, I'd like to share a little bit more about our authors. Dr. Becky Cohn-Vargas spent over 35 years as a teacher, principal, curriculum director, and superintendent in rural, urban, and suburban districts. In each setting, she focused on educational equity and effective strategies for diverse populations. Her work, along with other experts in the field, was integral in the development and design of resources and professional learning modules created by the AFT Identity-Affirming Classrooms team. Dr. Zecharian, founder of Zecharian and Associates, brings 3 decades of combined experience as a university faculty member, educational service agency leader, and district administrator. With scholarship in responsive leadership, instructional practices, family school partnerships, and policy analysis to benefit student outcomes, we are so excited to have her here with us today. Our moderator for today's episode, featuring chapters 3 and 4 on understanding our own identity and supporting positive identity development, is a member of the AFT Identity-Affirming Classroom team, Monique Boone. Monique is a seasoned educator with 19 plus years in the profession in the great state of Texas. She has served as an English teacher, interventionist, journalism teacher, instructional coach, instructional technology, STEM specialist, and school administrator before holding her current position as a district coordinator for English, language arts, and social studies for PreK 12. Monique joined the AFT PD team 10 years ago and is currently a national trainer and content creator and developer. Before I turn it over to Monique to introduce our guest contributor, Lenore Harris, whose story is chronicled in the chapters we'll discuss today, I want to remind you to feel free to use the Q&A widget to submit a question for any of our panelists as you watch and listen in. We'll get back to you as soon as possible to keep the conversation going. Monique?
And now I want to introduce to you our contributor, Lenore Harris. She is a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of San Francisco, where she earned her Master's of Art in Writing. She is a teacher and historical novelist. She was the Peter Taylor Fellow at the Kenyon Review Writers Workshop and the John Steinbeck Fellow at San Jose State University. She currently teaches English, literature, and social justice studies at West Valley College, where she is the co-coordinator of the Umoja program. So I want to start off with Debbi. So in chapter 3, Understanding Our Own Identity, you state, as educators, we must understand that our life experiences, that is, who we are as individuals and communities of people, can be vastly different from many of our individual and groups of students. What is the value of having educators reflect on their identities as they seek to support students with diverse identities?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that great question, Monique. What's so helpful when we talk about creating identity-safe spaces is for all of us to look at the concept of identity safety from a positive stance of inclusion instead of exclusion. A powerful example that we cite in the book is the book Far from the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search of Identity. In it, author Andrew Solomon explores the positive experiences that families had, families of children whose identities were vastly different than their own. For example, children who were transgender, deaf, prodigies, autistic children, and others. And it includes this wonderful example of the meaning that all of these families of these children derive in rearing their children. Books such as this one and our goal of being inclusive points to doing so much more than we might think of doing to be inclusive. That is, to really include everyone so that we can support children just to thrive in school and develop academically and socially and emotionally, and their parents to be partners with us. One great way for doing this is to really look at our own life experiences. That is, who we are as individuals and communities of people, especially because they may be vastly different than many of our students. In the book, for example, we present one of the contributors whose name is Jesus and his experience being raised on the Texas-Mexico border. Jesus and his brothers, his sisters, and his parents lived in an old warehouse. Their family was separated by a blanket in this warehouse, by this blanket for privacy from one other family that lived in the warehouse. And we ask the question, in what way does Jesus's childhood experience living in this warehouse environment, how is it the same or different from your own? And we ask, be as detailed as possible. How is his warehouse living experience with his family different from your own? And be as detailed as possible. And then when we look at sort of these differences, as author Becky and I have done in various professional development experiences, it really does shine a light on some of the differences that we experience and how these are so important for creating identity-safe spaces. We also ask that we look at our own personal experiences. And one that comes to mind is when I hear educators share how important it is to read to your child. My family didn't do that. Yet they did something else that was so important. My mother came to the US as a young child from Lithuania, and she loved to read and loved to go to the library. I remember being a little girl and going with my mom and my two sisters to the library and watching my mom take out all of the books that she wanted to read for the week. And I would run down to the children's library and select a stack of books that looked like just the same amount as hers. And then I would go home and I would read my book next to her, even if it meant pretending to read, as my mom did. So when I listen to educators talk about how important it is to read to your children, I talk about, and I've written about how important it is to observe literacy as a way of being, as a way of acting, and as a way of thinking about literacy beyond just being read to or taught. And I find myself thinking about the importance of what children observe and they see in order for us to hear and expand our ways of thinking about creating identity-safe spaces.
Thank you so much for sharing that. As an educator, I can definitely just relate to the personal stories from myself and from my students over the years. And as I sort of think about that, I want to volley it over to Becky. So you discussed the importance of educators. It's really looking at and examining their implicit and explicit biases. So can you give us some examples on how educators might do that?
Sure, thank you. It's so great to be with all of you today. It was wonderful writing the book and interviewing the many people we talked to. And I want to start by saying that honest self-reflection is a wonderful way we can learn about our families, and we can learn about how we can basically look back at the things we do and say, and what are the things that matter to us. And also we can look at whether we have blind spots or biases. Really, we all have biases. We've all been influenced by stereotypes that Claude Steele refers to as in the air. And those stereotypes sometimes help us navigate the world, but other times they limit us. And so when we examine our biases, we see how the attitudes may influence our behaviors and the way we treat our students and our children. A research study in 2018 found that some of the strongest levels of negative stereotyping was reported by white adults working with children who are Black and Latinx teens. And I found that they were 1.5 to 2 times more likely to consider the students violence prone and unintelligent than they were about white adults and teens. That's a very disturbing thing they found. And it's not the fault of the individuals. It's part of having a society where unequal conditions exist. So as we work to create identity safety, we really need to unpack and develop an awareness of our own biases and really see how they influence us so we can really help our students by being the best people we can be. And this can be done individually or in groups, and we can do it in short little spurts at faculty meetings. We can do it in conversations, but we have to be careful that we create a safe and trusting environment, that we don't shame anyone, and we really need ground rules to guide us to be safe. And the ground rules need to say, we're not talking about anybody else's feelings, we're not judging, we're not speaking for whole groups. We really want people to feel safe to open up. Throughout the book, we heard stories that were not very happy, stories where implicit bias and explicit bias actually limited a child's sense of academic prowess and their beliefs about their intelligence, and negative stereotypes about their race or their knowledge of English or their language or gender hampered their school experience. So by becoming aware and examining ourselves, it really helps a lot. One example was a man that I had met in a workshop, and he said he went to a workshop on understanding white privilege, and he was very negative about it. He didn't really think it applied to him, and he didn't like it. But many months later, he was in a situation where he was walking into a university, and he had to walk through the college police office to get somewhere in a faster way. And as he was walking through it very calmly, it suddenly struck him that if he had Black skin, he may not have felt so safe to just wander in through a police department. So this process can help, and it helps in ways as we look at our reactions and as we listen to each other and learn about each other. My personal journey, I call it taking a field trip into ourself. My personal field trip into myself allowed me to learn from some of the mistakes I made, be aware of some of the white privilege I have. For example, when I'm stopped by the police for driving or making a mistake, or even not making a mistake on the road, I'm not frightened. And it makes me realize that not everybody has that same experience. So I try and check myself and question myself. And it helps me understand my students' experiences, learn what they've gone through. And it also helps me change some of my oversensitivity, because certainly I have still many sensitivities about being judged. And recently, as anti-Semitic hate crimes have increased, some of those old fears from childhood of bad experiences I had of people saying weird things to me and anti-Semitic things to me have come up. So I really encourage us to help our students learn to feel competent learners and thinkers and reverse internalized feelings that they aren't intelligent by working to look inside ourselves. Thank you.
Oh man, thank you so much for that response. And as we dig into safe spaces and creating those for our students, I would like to ask Lenore. So you highlight the ways that you work with families to build positive identities at home, as well as through at school, through fostering pride in their identities. Can you share about how you did this with your son, Emmanuel, and how you do it with your students through fostering joy?
Thank you. First of all, I really want to say thank you for asking me to be here. And I'm so excited to be able to participate in this conversation. I think that far too often, well-intended, even the most well-intended educators and educational systems work only superficially to foster student identity. Once a month celebrations and food fairs are comforting, but they're not sustaining, right? They're not nurturing over like a long period of time. Like Debbie, I was raised by a mom who regularly took my sister and I to the library. And those trips to the library really cemented a love of books. But one of the things that was absent from that experience was books that represented me. There weren't a lot of books with Black protagonists, Black storylines. And when I became a mother, one of the things that was important to me was like to pass on my love of books to my son, but also to be much more intentional about making sure that those books represented him and his lived experience in our culture and in our home. And I remember reading to him when he was little, like a little boy, before he was even in preschool, this book that had like a little, brown skinned boy with like curly hair, like it was an illustrated picture book, and how he always pointed to that book and pointed to himself because he saw himself in that picture. And I just every time it just got me. And so now when I'm looking at schools, when I was, going through the process of looking through schools, one of the things I always did was go through the libraries, walk through every library looking for like, what kind of books y'all have up in here? And if I see some books that are have Black authors, have Black protagonists, then I'm like, okay, this is probably a space that's going to be supportive of my son. But if there's only like biographies of Martin Luther King and Maya Angelou, then I think we probably got some work to do here. And so I think that experience as a parent also informed my experience as an educator. And so I think a lot of what about it, as Becky kind of talked about this idea of self-reflection, I'm thinking about my own experience as a mother and how do I bring that into the classroom as an educator. So during COVID, when I became the co-coordinator and the English teacher for the Umoja program, Umoja being a program that is a learning community of students of African descent, I was thinking about what I wanted to teach, what experience did I want to impart to my students. And so much of our conversation during that time was centered around Black trauma. This is the period of like the Black Lives Matters movement. And what I really wanted to do was to flip that conversation on its head so that we had a conversation that was about fostering joy, so that my students came out of that experience feeling empowered, feeling like they could attack the world, not from the space of anger, but from a place of being centered in their own authenticity and self-love, right? So in creating a class around Black joy, we focused on the aspects of our culture that are edifying for us. So we talk about food as a means of identity. We talk about Black music. We talk about Black humor. We have entire conversations around African American vernacular English and other Englishes, and the ways in which they represent our experience. And I find that my students are excited because we are having conversations about their culture that's not only worthy of celebration, but also worthy of scholarship. Like, these are conversations it's not superficial. It's educational, right? And it's connected to my lived experience.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. It gives me goosebumps as an educator and a parent. I can relate. And as I read through the chapter, I really, really just could connect with a lot of things that you said in throughout the book, throughout that chapter. And so let me ask you, Becky, what are some other ways that educators can affirm identities in schools? And how can we also support families to do the same thing at home?
As I was listening to Lenore, I remembered an experience I had when I was a curriculum director. And a parent called me. She's African American, and her daughter was one of two Black students in the 4th grade at her child's school. And she said, it seems like every time they talk about Black students, they're talking about bad things that happened to them. And my child is just starting to feel stigmatized when they talk about slavery and inequality. And she said, why don't they talk about the Black Harlem Renaissance with all the art and the music that came out of that period? And so I took it back to the school, and it really struck the teacher, who meant well when she was trying to be inclusive. She didn't think about what it was like from that child's point of view. And in our book, the people we talked to shared how their identities developed, and parents shared how they helped their children develop pride and a feeling of dignity and worth. Over and over, we heard them talk about two things. First, they talked about the need for many, many positive experiences that affirm each of their children's social identities. And then secondly, they talked about helping the kids learn to counteract the negative experiences and things that might happen inadvertently as kids were growing up. So I'll give you a few examples. For the first one, it's how do we create that positive experience by validating the child? And sometimes it's by things like having books in the library, which, as both Debbi and Lenore talked about, are really important. And right now, with all these book bans happening, libraries are being really negatively impacted. And we really need to keep working on that. Another way to do it is by having role models where children see themselves reflected, not only in the books, but actually in people. And that means diversifying our staff at school. And I had an example in the book. There was an example of Jesus, which Debbi talked about. Jesus, who grew up near the border in Mexico. And in his 12 years of schooling, he only had one teacher who shared his Chicano background. And that was Mr. Perez, his chemistry teacher. And Mr. Perez inspired him to attend college. And if you can believe it, Jesus decided to study chemistry because of Mr. Perez's chemistry teacher. So he majored in chemistry, but in the end, his passion was to learn about writing and journalism. And he is currently writing a book about the history of the border area between Texas and Mexico, where he grew up. And he also became the PR person and the main person for the University of California chancellor at UC Berkeley. So the role model played a huge, important thing in his life. But we also need to help kids process feelings when they have negative experiences. We can't stop all the negative comments that children are going to encounter, like the kids who listen to people chanting at a football game, build the wall, build the wall. And it was a football game between a school that had many white students and another school that had many Latinx students. Laura was a person we interviewed in the book. She's white, married to an African-American man. And she shared about the difficult conversation they had to have with their 12-year-old son when they discussed the brutality he might experience in the future as a Black man and what to do when it happens. And She explained in quotes, "My husband Ken shared his experiences in a generalized way. And then we showed our son what to do with his hands, what to say, and we explained why he should not run away and do all the things he needed to do to keep himself safe as possible." It's a hard thing to face, but we do need to help our kids so they can process things. And when negative things happen in your classrooms or our schools, such as microaggression and bullying, other biased behaviors, we need to educate our students rather than punish them so that it doesn't happen again. So these are just a few of the many things where we can make it a safe space for our children to come around and feel pride in who they are, as well as feel confident and strong to stand up for themselves.
Thank you so much for sharing. And as we talk about some of those negative experiences and how we can change those and cultivate just positive experience for students at school as well as at home, Lenore, can you share with us about your son's journey as being a bright student who struggled with reading and how his identity was undermined because of this? And how did you work to find a school setting that would help him flourish?
Well, thank you. Emmanuel started off school, I think, like many students began school, like really excited about learning, excited about socializing. I have like I had this beautiful extroverted, precocious child who by the time he was in first grade was kind of dreading going to school, and I didn't know what was happening. And I remember having my first meeting with his first grade teacher, during which she told me that my child never should have left kindergarten and that he didn't know his ABCs. And I actually think that there's a way in which you can have a conversation about your child's development that would allow the parent to feel like they're a partner in the journey to assist your child. This wasn't that conversation. This conversation was, your child is broken and I don't know why he's here. And I remember being shocked. I remember feeling really, really angry, and being in kind of a deep state of denial because my son didn't have a diagnosis at that time. And I said, there's clearly some kind of mistake here. I came back to that classroom just to observe my child in the class, like just to see what was going on. And I saw his body language. His shoulders were slumped. And even though he was sitting at a table with other students, he looked like he was alone. And I remember going to my car and crying because I felt like I had failed him by allowing him to be stuck in this experience with a teacher who didn't believe in him. And one of the things I did after I pulled myself together was schedule a meeting with the administrator of the school, because I knew that I had to talk to her about what I had observed in the classroom and what I knew to be true about my kid, like about his about his intellect and enthusiasm and his love of learning. And I had to advocate for him to be in a classroom with somebody who believed in him. And luckily for me, I was working with an administrator who listened to me and said, I trust your instincts as a parent. And I'm going to help you to find the right space for your child, even if that means that this school is not it. And we collaborated together. This is when we began to do testing for with regard to his reading, but she never doubted or allowed me to doubt in my own child's strength and wisdom and his intelligence. And that empowered me to make better decisions as a parent moving forward. I'm still grateful to her for not denying my experience as a parent, for validating my feelings as a parent in that particular moment. I still am grateful to her. And it allowed me to kind of like use that strength, that platform to make decisions for him moving forward, to put him in the place where I thought and knew that he was going to be validated as a student.
Thank you so much for sharing your son's experience and how you guys worked through that. And it really makes me think about our multilingual learners. So Deb, I know that you have experience in this area. So how can we support our students who have multiple languages, who are maybe learning a new language? How can we support their languages and cultures?
I think a way of answering it is to look back at the courageousness and the power of what Lenore just shared with us about her experience with her beautiful son, Emmanuel, and how she knew to speak to someone about helping the greatness of her son have that great experience in school. And it's really what we want all students to have. And so what Lenore, I think, talked about was the power of her going to an administrator and how that administrator really acknowledged and valued what Lenore had to say about what she knew about her child. And when we think of a very large population who might not have the linguistic skills yet to be able to express to staff, the community, what they're thinking, it's just so important. So the wonderful story and experience that Lenore just shared with us really links to what we really have to be thinking about the fastest growing group of students in the United States, and that's multilingual learners. And what distinguishes them from any other group or underrepresented group is their enormous diversity. Many are born in the United States. Others come from many, many countries around the globe, especially from Latin America and Asia. They also speak hundreds of different home languages and dialects and represent many, many different identities, including their multilingual identity, their ethnic identity, for many, their refugee status identity, their citizenry status, their economic identity, their racial identity, and much, much more. It's also important for us to support their identity safety, especially as immigration becomes an even more divisive topic. While the variability of this group is like no other and demands a multifaceted response from all of us that goes far beyond the need for a student to learn English, it really means thinking carefully about what our biggest goal is, and that is to create a strong, positive program, partnering with families, partnering with others that we work with, so that we can really be sure that we've designed and enacted plans that really will be the most successful for this very diverse population, and one that'll really stand through the test of time and will be flexible and adaptive enough to change over time. And during the past decade, there have been wonderful changes that have happened to many programs for multilingual learners. First, there's been a wonderful renewed interest in dual language programming, where all school-age children have the opportunity to learn in 2 languages and earn the seal of biliteracy. What's wonderful about that is it honors multilingual learners for who they are and what they can bring to learning. Another is that leadership trends and teaching practices are leaning far more toward using a collaborative approach where we realize that we're much more successful not working in a silo, but working with everyone who works on behalf of our children or our students. And a third is using culturally and linguistically sustaining practices across all we do to support us in planning and enacting really high quality lessons that resonate, are meaningful for learners, really help learners see the positives of what they can bring to a classroom because their linguistic and cultural assets are honored and strengthened. And there's also this important need for us to understand, and this is something that's happened within the past decade, is we've become far more knowledgeable, not just about culturally and linguistically sustaining practices, but as a field of educators, we've become much more knowledgeable about the epic number of students who are experiencing adverse childhood experiences. And so many multilingual learners have experienced beyond abuse, neglect, and household challenge. They've come to us having experienced war and civil strife, deep natural disasters that have occurred in their own countries, and more. So the fact that we've sort of grappled with a lot of these changes, both the value of dual language, the value of working collaboratively, the high value of using culturally and linguistically sustained practices, where we really honor and value our students, is just so darn important. And then using practices that really affirm and acknowledge students who've experienced adversity. And it isn't that we want people to ignore what's occurred, but we want to help students see their capacity and resilience through experiencing adversity by using a strength-based approach that really honors and acknowledges who students are and what they bring to learning. And all of these changes and trends that I've just discussed are leading us to think much more positively and intentionally and collectively about how we can really support the success of what Becky and I call multi-diverse students, meaning when we create programming that's successful for multilingual learners who are so diverse, it benefits every student as we're doing so by really looking at what we can do to really help benefit a student for who they are, our whole school, our whole community, to truly support every one of us to feel safe, a sense of belonging, value, and competence, and the confidence to speak up for ourselves and for others.
So as you talk about your the term multi-diverse students, which is just a great term, by the way, it makes me think about Lenore's story and how she felt, she needed to step in for her son. So Lenore, can you tell us about some ways that you felt supported as a parent through your experience with your son, from teachers and administrators, and how they partner with you to help your son Emmanuel's academic identity turn into a successful school experience?
Yeah, thank you, Debbi, because I'm so inspired by the things that you said, and I think about all of the experiences that our students bring to the classroom and how that can be supported by administrators. When I think about my son's experience in school, I think that we have been very lucky and blessed that we have had people who have been willing to learn from me when I am speaking to them, when I am talking to them about this is what I'm observing happening in the classroom with my son. Almost all of them have been willing. I can recall an incident, and there have been more than one, but I remember my son being at an independent school where he was feeling isolated because the one other Black child in that in his class had been promoted to to middle school, and so he was feeling isolated and alone, and he was sharing that with his teacher, and the teacher was like, well, you're not the only person of color here. We have this person and this person and this person. And later on, when I was talking to the teacher, I had to remind him, I said, well, all of those folks are biracial and white passing. So they don't look like my son. Like, he's the darkest person in his classroom. So in his mind, he is the only brown person there. And it is an isolating feeling. And luckily for me, I was speaking with a person who was willing to listen and to learn from that. So because we had a very deep talk about colorism and how that impacts young people. And so in every step of our journey, our educational journey, I think it has been important that the folks that I've spoken to have been willing to listen. Right now in his present middle school, which is a public school in Oakland, I get a weekly progress report from the learning specialist on my son's progress, not just his academic progress, but also his emotional, social progress. How is he responding to feedback? What is his relationship with the teachers? And because he's now a preteen, right, and really only responds to conversations when I ask him how it's going in school, he really just goes, what, yeah, it's good. It's really helpful because it absolutely allows me to kind of have some insight into what his academic life is like. These teachers at the school have give out their personal telephone numbers on back to school night, so parents have that. I had one day where I was assisting my son with his homework, and we had run into a roadblock. I fired off an email, before we went to bed. And the next morning when I was driving to my job, this teacher called me to have a conversation about it. And that kind of responsiveness from an instructor is encouraging to me. It builds confidence in my relationships with them. I feel like now when I walk down there and I have to have a conversation with them, whether or not it's comfortable, or uncomfortable, at least I'm going to get it. I'm going to get some hearing and I'm going to get some response. And it's that kind of responsiveness, that kind of intentionality on the part of administrators and educators. I think that makes a tremendous difference in your child's journey.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I want to ask you, Debbi, in each chapter in the book, you have a section called Positively Countering Opposition, which I think ties right into Lenore's experience as well, and having tools to be able to counter that opposition. Can you explain why you have this section in the book and some ways you suggest schools work to counter the opposition as they support families to feel safe, to feel identity safe, rather?
Yeah, it's wonderful again to hear Lenore's voice around what she's done to really help Emmanuel. And part of that is that sense of safety, belonging, value, competence, but very importantly, the confidence to speak up on behalf of ourselves and others. So what we hear is how Lenore goes and she feels confident to speak up on behalf of her son, which is wonderful. And that's the type of partnership that we really want to have with families. But if we think about that, we really need to be intentional about honoring and affirming the strengths that educators have, that families have. And we can see the many strengths that Lenore has as a mother, as a person, as in knowing her child better than anyone else. And in really that students possess, of which I'm sure Emmanuel possesses a lot of strengths, so that we can take actions to really foster and cultivate identity-safe practices and ways of being and acting in school and at home and everywhere that really support students to succeed, and not just to succeed in school, but to succeed in their lives. And the reason we have this, how we can positively counter opposition is, as Becky shared with us, a lot of us, if not all of us, are going to encounter opposition to something. And many of us believe, especially now, that highlighting our differences is going to divide us somehow, and that it would be better to wipe away all of our differences, whatever these might be, all of our multi-diversity, just erase it, so that we can be one big, supposedly happy community. And our response to this belief or perception is a big, resounding, absolutely no. If any one of us feels marginalized, a colorblind environment can make us feel even more invisible and more isolated and more marginalized. And in a great sense, we have to take a transformational view for treating differences as assets and a means to strengthen our capacity to work together and strengthen what we're doing to benefit everyone, so that all of us have the confidence to speak up on behalf of ourselves and others. And one important aspect of this is what to do before we encounter opposition, like what should we do? And what we talk about in every chapter of our book is a sampling of ideas to positively counter the kinds of opposition that we might experience. For example, one of the chapters focuses on positive identity development. And in it, we present the misnomer that teaching U.S. history can foster reverse racism, guilt, discomfort. And we cite the AFT, which is wonderful, and the National Council for Social Studies, and many, many educators who recommend that we positively counter this type of opposition by doing three things. First, we educate our families and the public about what we're teaching in school. Second, we explain the importance of teaching accurate and fact-based history, and that racism is wrong. And third, that we dramatize in authentic, non-political, non-confrontational ways the harm of what restricting what is taught in American schools can do. Our goal in providing a positive counter across the book is to counter opposition in a way that continuously helps us all in creating identity-safe schools, identity-safe homes, and an identity-safe world.
So as you talk about your thoughts, it brings me to the work, the action piece of the book, which is phenomenal. It gives educators just some work that we can do around this. And I know in the first podcast, we talked about working groups. And so, Becky, I want to ask you, can you describe the cycle of inquiry you propose for a team effort for parents and guardians and educators working together in this work for identity safety at home as well as in schools?
Sure. That's a great way as we draw to a close what we're talking about today. What we try and do is not only give examples and stories, but we also try and provide actionable things people can do to bring schools and families together as a team. And that's the working group we talk about that has members from administrators, teachers, staff, multi-diverse parents, guardians, multi-diverse everyone. And with older students, they can be part of it too. And I know that I was once a principal, and in my school, we had a leadership team with teachers and parents and special ed teachers and our parent center liaison and parents and community organizations, and even people who provided healthcare and mental health services. And it was such a rich group because it allowed us to work as a team and hear each other and figure out what we needed to do to improve our school and how we could solve problems. And for another example is a working group in another school district where they had tardiness was a problem. So their working group came together and they talked about it. They didn't jump into solutions like, tell parents they have to get their kids to school on time. They looked at the conditions and they realized that some students came on a city bus and that bus schedule itself made it impossible for them to arrive on time consistently. So they started working with the bus company to rectify it. that's what can come out of a working group when they really start digging into how they can work together. And so in our book, we also talk about this cycle of inquiry, how we work, not only what we do, but how we work. And we create the cycle. It's kind of a self-sustaining, continuous cycle, like a circle. We have to have a graphic. And the first thing in the cycle is to be positive about partnering. And to do that, we really have to create a welcoming environment where people get to know each other. We don't jump into the problems. We jump into really building relationships. And we start sharing ideas and learning from each other and building trust. And listening and being able to hear varying points of view, which is a thing that is becoming very important in this current climate. Secondly, we talk about creating a culture of care and curiosity as we get to know each other, really listening to the hopes and dreams and challenges each other has. And maybe one of the parents has a great idea that seems far-fetched, but don't cut it off, listen to it. And so we work together and really try to come up with creative things. And in our working group, one of the things that happened was somebody suggested an idea of having an assembly where not only do we perform for each other, but we teach each other the dances from our different backgrounds. And so we gathered in the auditorium and we had this fabulous assembly where everybody was dancing together. We all were standing up there. We took out all the chairs and we learned a Mexican folk dance, and then the Cambodian parents taught us one of their dances. And at that time, we even danced the Macarena and the Hokey Pokey. And so everybody had a really good time, and it was a chance to do something different. The third area in our cycle of inquiry is to be open, to examine and value differences. And that means we have to really communicate the value of diversity and recognize that with all our different identities, and people aren't, when we talk about social identities, we're talking about the fact that everybody has different ones. Their gender identity, their intelligence, their physical and disabilities, and different, like Debbie was talking about, the ethnic background, the nationality, and different families. And you can have two kids who appear to be exactly the same in ethnicity, and turns out that they have very, very different experiences. So we need to model the willingness to share these differences, to welcome the different perspectives, and recognize that right now in this time of polarization, we need to discuss differences in a civil way and learn how to have civil discourse about these differences. And we also now have to notice the unspoken things, the way people feel about expressing themselves, trying not to put people on the spot as we do it. The fourth one on the cycle is support reflective, strength-based attitudes and experiences. And that strength-based approach that Debbie taught, Debbie talked about, we need to really talk about how our team members are going to have different strengths. Some people may be good at facilitating meetings. Some may be good at making phone calls, and others hate making phone calls to bring people to meetings, and drawing from all those differences and making our team stronger. And we need to regularly communicate with the families and share the strengths and articulate them. And that is true also by looking at progress and the different ways we communicate with families. Number 5 in the cycle is viewing the mistakes and failures that happen all the time as opportunities for learning and growing. A non-judgmental culture creates a space where people don't worry about speaking up. They don't worry about failing because they know that we'll pick each other up and keep going. And that's true when we work individually with families, and that's when we work in our groups. That's true. And by taking responsibility for our own mistakes, we're also modeling that for the group and showing that, yeah, we're making mistakes too. I remember when I taught 4th grade, my kids did this video project where they interviewed a teacher, and they discovered that their principal had actually dropped out of school and had to go back to school to get his degree. And they also discovered, they said to this one teacher, "Did you ever get a bad grade?" they thought that if you had a bad grade, you would fail and that would be the end of it. So we all need to work on this area. And then finally, in the cycle of inquiry, we talk about honoring and celebrating success. We don't see success very often. We often take the success for granted and jump to the next problem. And I think it's really important to celebrate those successes. In the school where I was principal, they recently celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Family Resource Center. And that gives away how long ago I worked there, because I was part of starting that Family Resource Center. But it was so beautiful to go back and see that program still thriving. And parent leaders spoke in English and in Spanish and Vietnamese and shared their stories. They made tamales, students performed. And we need to recognize change is slow, and we need to communicate and celebrate incremental progress.
Thank you all so much. This concludes our session for today, but Becky, Debbi, Monique, Lenore, your stories and expertise is going to have a deep impact on making this world, not just our schools, not just our homes, but this world, an identity-safe space. Thank you so much for partnering with the AFT and highlighting some real solutions for kids and families, providing tried and true approaches to sustaining equitable learning environments. And most importantly, thank you to the audience for taking the time to join us in the midst of your busy schedules. There were so many things that resonated with me as I listened. And if I went through all of them, we'd be here for another hour. But just a couple of things. Take that field trip inside yourself. Work collectively with your communities to create trust and safe. Set ground rules. There's no need for shame. We need to learn and work on this together. We know reading opens the world. Make sure the books have all the colors of the world and the rainbow in them. Advocacy for our parents. Lenore, you provided an example for parents to begin to voice their concerns or share what they want for their children and be a partner in schools. Extremely powerful. And if we didn't walk away with something that we can do right away, then I'm not sure what to tell you. So with that, I want you to make sure that you complete the exit ticket, because on that exit ticket, we want to hear what resonated with you today. We want you to list a couple of strategies that you're prepared to take into action when you return to your communities. And then also share something that you yourself or your community organizations are doing to foster identity-safe and affirming spaces. Also, make sure you join us next week for episode 3, where we will discuss chapters 5, 6, and 7, harnessing the power of connectedness, cooperation, and compassion, building empowerment, agency, and resilience, and moving away from the same old habits to professional growth. You will not want to miss this. And lastly, be sure to download your certificate and check out some of the resources that we have for you. Also, be on the lookout for information about an X-Chat and how you can participate in that, when it will be, and we can continue this conversation. Thank you again. Be well, go forth, and continue to carry out the mission to overcome inequity.